60% of employees held back an idea or concern at work in the last year because they were afraid of the consequences of saying it out loud. 60%. And that's not just your junior employees in their first job. It's not even just people who had no idea what they're talking about in the first place, right? This is people, it's really everybody in your organization. People who are and were in the room when the big decision was made. They were sitting there and something they knew mattered, and they chose not to say it. And I've walked into enough business emergencies to tell you that this is almost always part of the story. Because the stuff that happened, or the disconnects that were there, or the conflicting targets that derailed the execution, somebody always tells me after that they knew. Signal was there, someone had it, but it wasn't received. Or worse, maybe it was never sent. And the expensive version of this is not related to everyday conversations, right? It matters there. But where it really becomes expensive is the moment before significant commitments or significant change. So new deals, a major piece of outsourcing, transformations, exits, new strategy, something big. Because typically the right people are in the room or involved in the making of the plan in some way or shape. But even then, they're not saying everything they know. And of course, we kind of understand also why, right? Because in that moment, it's about forward momentum. And the social dynamics are typically pretty clear. And so being the person who raises concern after concern, who's kind of Debbie Downer, is the one who gets being seen as being difficult and not wanting the progress or the improvement and not being the team player who's also helping to move the business forward. And so people don't raise things or don't raise all of the things. And then 6 months later, that concern is no longer a concern, but really the thing that derailed things. Well, there is an exercise that changes this. And that exercise doesn't make people suddenly brave or, speak up about everything, because creating a speak up culture in an organization is really hard. It takes forever to build up. But you can create a setup, do an exercise in a structure where in the room, everybody has to contribute what they know before the plan gets executed in a really natural setting. And in the oil and gas industry, we call exercise like this, for instance, drilling the well on paper. It also exists in some shape in disaster management, where it's called tabletop exercises. And basically every industry or sector where failure is basically catastrophic or lives are at stake, they do variations to this. But the challenge is that business decisions don't feel like life or death. Things just unravel slower, and hence I've not seen as much adoption of this practice in business. But I think it's an invaluable one. So today, I'm going to give you this exercise. And in the business emergency room setting, I'm calling it the pre-mortem. I've put it into 8 steps, and I think you could do this in as little as 60 minutes. I'm also going to talk to you about the 3 things it does that you probably do not expect. Added bonuses, so to speak. So, let's get into it. I am Maartje van Krieken, founder of the Chaos Games Consulting and host of the Business Emergency Room, the podcast for leaders navigating volatility, complexity, and organizational chaos. Every episode, I bring you battle-tested frameworks, honest practitioner conversations, and the kind of straight talk that does not make it into most boardrooms. Whether you're in the middle of a crisis, coming out of one, or smart enough to want to avoid the next one, you are in the right place. Let's get into it. Welcome to this week's of the Business Emergency Room. I am really excited about this one. Of course, I'm excited about most episodes, but this tool to me, this exercise has so much value. I've seen variations use it as a sailor, as a skipper. I've seen it used in disaster management and very effectively in the industry I used to work in. And I kept seeing what it can do to fine-tune a plan before it gets executed. and so avoid so many of these silly little pitfalls that could have massive consequences. And so I want all of you to know about this. I think it can be totally deployed, fit for purpose in so many different ways, shapes, and situations, and be of use. And to me, it easily renders so much value that it pays itself back almost before you leave the room. So let's start with the numbers. I'm an engineer. I like numbers. To convince you that there's value in something like this, 67% of well-formulated strategies, and I think it's the strategies you could read plans here, fail due to poor execution. So not poor planning, but the execution part of it. Yeah. 80% of CEOs also report that their strategy is not well understood, even within their own company. So even before the execution begins, there is something not quite right? And I feel safe to say you can extend it to any, not just the strategies, but almost any kind of plan. Also, 85% of leaders say adaptability is critical, yet only 7% believe they are successfully leading it or have adaptability in their business. And this tool or exercise, the Pre-Mortem, addresses all of that. So what is a Pre-Mortem and what is it maybe not? It's not a risk register. You know all that. I'm a big fan of strategic risk management, and I think you should do that in your business. But in risk management, you look at uncertainty that may or may not unfold, and you look at it typically at a business level or at macro levels. This is much more practical than that. This is also not a brainstorming session, right? An exercise like this is not about being creative. It's not open-ended, and it's not about coming up with as many ideas as possible. It's also not the opposite of that. This is not about pessimism. This is not about, shooting at the idea until it dies. That's not what we're trying to do here. What it is actually is a reality check, or maybe more appropriately, a structured truth-telling exercise that looks at the strategy or proposal and plan and how it will be executed. And then working through that entire definition and operation sequence on paper with all the relevant disciplines present to make sure that everybody's on the same page, that we've captured all the potential interface issues, the faulty assumptions, the inconsistencies, the interdependencies, etc., etc. Because at that point, it's still easy to fix the challenges we find, right? And doing that before you commit, well, that makes a lot of sense, right? So as you heard me say, in oil and gas, exercises like this are, for instance, drilling the well on paper, which is pretty easy to understand if you know nothing about drilling wells, what that might look like. And yeah, basically every industry where failure is immediately visible or cost life, there's a version of it, right? A business can fail gradually over years, and nobody's really accountable or held accountable in the moment. And so it also doesn't immediately lead to loss of life, but that asymmetry is not necessarily an excuse maybe to not do this. I think there's a real opportunity to adopt this in business. And I think I've spoken with enough enthusiasm to show you that this is a real no-brainer to me. What I also really like about this, before we get into the practicalities of it, that it's the business resilience that this exercise builds by going through the motions, right? You basically address what I call, or what the industry often calls, the single path to success problem. What happens is that most plans that are actually made, or put forward, that by the time the decision is made, that plan is built around one path. Yeah, it's a singular solution. This is the red line to success. This is exactly what it's going to look like, and these are all the steps we're going to take. But the problem is then the real world comes into play, right? In the meantime, whilst you're executing it, some of the assumptions you made are going to shift or turn out not to be true. The world keeps moving. And every assumption that you build into that plan is really a dependency. And if not enough of that is named and they're not monitored, and you've locked it down to one single path forward, and that's what's been shared with everybody, you've lost that ability to quickly and effectively course correct when reality diverges, which it almost always does, of course. And if you do a pre-mortem, it doesn't necessarily give you a plan B, but you will see that it will lead to an understanding of plan A that's deep enough to build a plan B in the time you actually have when you need it. So what does the actual exercise look like? And if you happen to have been in the military or work in banking, and you have a different variation of this that you're very familiar with, just like all the decision frameworks I talk about, please use your own or adapt your own, right? That is totally makes sense to me. I'm giving you the 8 steps of the exercise I use, and I think whatever you use should have all of this in some way, shape, or form covered in there. Also, before we talk about the 8 steps, I think you need an independent facilitator for this. If you are supposed to be a contributor but also facilitating the session, that is really hard. There's just too much different thinking hats going on that you would need to cover. So you need an independent facilitator. It can totally be somebody from inside your organization who's not involved in this particular challenge or setup. You can also bring an outside facilitator. This is the kind of stuff I do, and many of my peers do as well. That really would be a more practical way to go about it and will lead to much better results. So the 8 steps. Step number 1 is define what's actually being stress tested, right? What specifically are we executing, to what end, under what constraints? And we're not talking about the commercial objective. We're really looking at the operational scope to deliver on the commercial promise, right? The decision at a high level is already made, and the plan is put forward. To deliver something, you need to understand what that plan that you're reviewing is supposed to deliver, and then say, okay, if that's what it's supposed to deliver, how does it need to be executed so it actually does that? And you need to have the parameters that will govern every decision during execution, some of the boundaries, the assumptions, and somebody needs to be able to put this forward clearly, and the people in the room need to be able to ask questions about this. If you get a lot of questions in this space, then that means there's too much ambiguity in the definition of your plan, right? So welcome those questions, because that is the first stress test. So as an example, if we're applying this to an outsourcing decision, right? So you're outsourcing your invoicing, for instance. Well, we need to know what scope is outsourced and what stays. You need to know what kind of contract management controls or performance metrics are going to be agreed or included in the contract. So is it managed on volume or on success ratios or on timeliness? What are some of these things? What are the switchover timelines? Is the outsourcing party assumed to be working in your infrastructure or in their own IT infrastructure? Are they going to be working to their own standards or to yours? Some of these factors would need to be known then, yeah? Then in step 2, what you do is that you walk the execution plan in sequence. So there's some pre-work that can happen here. Those who make the plan, I always like visuals, right? A big poster on the wall that basically shows in sequence the different steps that the execution will work through. That makes group conversation so much easier and might make you a little faster in the session. I'm totally okay if there is pre-work done in this. I don't think there's that useful to put everything in order. But then you talk people, the rest of the team, through the order that you put out there, and you might need to correct some of that already, right? The order that you put up might already inherently have some faulty logic in there. But you want people to walk with you through the logic and agree what can happen in parallel and what cannot, and what triggers what, the interdependencies there. And do all the people who know or need to be involved in the various steps, are they aware and does it make sense to them, right? And where are there handovers that are outside teams? Where do things go from one team to another team? Specifically, those you also want to highlight. Which brings me to step 3. You want to identify the decision points. At each phase transition, there is a moment where there's a decision to be made, right? Go, no-go decisions, the last chance to modify something. And you want to name every one of those decisions in advance and define what information is needed to make that call, who has the authority to make that, and what are the criteria for the possible outcomes, or what would be a go or no-go criteria, for instance, right? And you want to do that when things are calm and you can clearly think about it and have some definition around this. So in the outsourcing example, at which point in an outsourcing situation, for instance, will you start switching off internal capabilities? At which point do they need access to your systems? How long will you run redundancy? How soon will you start to see if their performance is up to scratch? And is there like a trial period or trial batches? All of that. Then step 4, name the known and the unknown. So for each phase of the execution plan, typically you can break it up in some phases or blocks, and you do it for those sections. Say, okay, for this piece of the process, what are the knowns and the unknowns? And unknowns can also just be things that are just simply not yet confirmed. And that unknown column is very important. It's just as important as the known one. I've seen so often that there's stuff in the known that is actually an assumption. And somebody says, yeah, it's only like that 80% of the time, because in 20% of the cases that actually looks like this. That's really good to know, right? So there's nothing right or wrong about this. But equally, there is stuff that nobody remembers anymore where it came from or how it came into the plan. And sometimes we don't remember that we took it as an assumption and we were supposed to confirm it because we can, but we never did it. So important to map all that out and sanity check that, right? Then step number 5 is the what if scenarios. So, and this is just for the major items in the unknown column. I'm totally okay if you would prioritize something in there and don't do this for all of the things. But for the big stuff in the unknown column, the stuff that you cannot basically get better insight on and will remain an unknown, on some of it, you want to do a bit of speculation saying, okay, if it doesn't pan out the way we're currently assume, or, it could be assumption around legislation, or it could be an assumption about how quickly the two IT systems are going to be able to talk to each other in the outsourcing example. Well, what if that turns out to cost 2 months longer? How are we then going to run this? What do we do about this, right? So you want to run some what if scenarios on the big ticket items. And typically in the room, there's good consensus on which ones are worth gaming on a little bit. And it typically leads to some pre-agreed actions to prep a little bit for some of these possible scenarios. And this is where you build business resilience truly. We'll come back to that a little bit later. Then, step 6, resource confirmation. You want to confirm every resource the plan depends on is actually secured. And that could include checks that there's resources and bums on seats, as they would say, with the outsourcing party to actually execute the work. But I want to highlight that the most common unsecured resource in any business execution plan, in my experience, is typically the internal team's time and attention. So when there is a big change project or whatever, or a big implementation, there is usually people assigned to that project team and stuff. So the resources for that are there. But did somebody also check and looked at who in the other departments in the organization will at very specific times need time and energy and attention for this and needs to be involved in the process? And can they accommodate that at a time that the plan will need it? And if the plan derails for some reason, or is delayed, or is faster or slower or whatever, does that then still work for the other teams who need to provide people and capacity? So have a conversation about the resourcing and think about completeness together. Then step 7, I need you to put this in some kind of shared document, right? You need to capture and share the output so that everyone executing has the same picture. And whatever shape you choose to do that in, I don't care if you make it a fun video or whatever, but that captured output is the vehicle. It's the shared understanding is the point. In the exercises I've been part of in oil and gas, that drill, dwell, and paper exercise, that sign-off is actually mandatory. I think in business, you should also make it explicit, because there's something around that. It's more than symbolism of everybody who was in the room putting ultimately their signature under it and saying, yeah, I was there, I was part of it, and I know and agree to what was included in here and what we came up with. You want to capture that, and you want to capture some of the conversations that happened, because you can use that later, and we'll come to that too. And then last but not least, it's a very formal thing again, in typically stemming from the nature of where these exercises typically are used. And then we call it the stop work authority. I don't think any businesses will have any formal stop work authority in the majority of cases where you should be deploying this, but it does actually really make sense to name who has the authority, or maybe the responsibility, to pause execution and what triggers that conversation. So in many of the subjects we tackle on this podcast, I talk about watch your out, right? We have such a bias, a commitment bias, right? It's like once you've bought a new car when you maybe didn't really need it, then somebody says, oh, new car. And you hear yourself explaining, yeah, because this was a really good deal. We do that, right? Once we've committed to go left, right, center, whatever, once we've committed to a path, we bias ourselves that that's the right way, and we keep going sometimes longer than we should. So have that conversation. What are the real big go, no-go points? How would we see failure starting to see? What are the signals we need to monitor? And who owns that? So basically the stop work authority in business, to me, is a gatekeeper. It's having identified what are named signals and named signal owners, right, with clear escalation rights, that will protect saying, hey, yes, we've started the whole outsourcing process, we made a transition, and after we've made it through this step and through this step, and it's still not working and it's still not performing, we're going to stop this now. We're going to stop it, and we're going to take pause, and we're going to really figure out if we need to keep going with this or change the plans completely, because we're so far down all the not good scenarios of what we looked at. You need that, and you need to do that before it gets there, because nobody in the moment, if nobody owns it, are people going to speak up and take ownership and say to here and no further? Typically not. So 8 steps. You can run this for much execution-oriented plans, maybe 60 minutes. And for generally complex or high stakes ones, take half a day, maybe put some extra cycles in the what ifs. But this really does not take as long as you think. Before we wrap this up, I want to highlight quickly 3 things a pre-mortem actually also does. Because it saves time, it builds trust, and it improves your ability to improvise. On the saving time, it might be counterintuitive, but it's absolutely true. Because most leaders resist doing stuff like this because they think they do not have the time to really dig through something. But that's kind of backwards, because every hour in a pre-mortem replaces multiple hours in crisis management, course correction, communication issues, and leadership bandwidth consumed with fixing something that could have been fixed beforehand. And so the conversation might feel like a delay, but it prevents massive detours. Also, if you did the exercise well, you know where the biggest challenges are, and so you'll be monitoring progress more effectively and course correct quicker. So you're probably saving time there too, right? Trust. It's a much hyped term in business these days, but not so easy to maintain or build, right? And to me, this exercise has always shown to be a very practical trust building tool and a very durable one. Because what happens is that this exercise puts colleagues in a room who, because of everybody so busy, don't always spend enough time understanding and truly seeing what happens in other people's silos, right? And in other people's parts of the business. And through an exercise like this, in my experience, you build so much trust from seeing and being reminded and understanding how much skill and capability and experience all your colleagues actually have. Also, the exercise gives explicit permission through structure. So it sets up a structure where people have to speak out, say the things they need to say. They need to contribute from their discipline, their expertise, or their part of the value chain or part of the business. But it also allows everybody as peers to contribute, looking through fresh eyes at what's put up by others and how the whole connected chain looks, and say, hey, this to me doesn't make quite sense, or explain me again, because now I'm understanding I'm part of this execution. So I want to understand, or I see a disconnect or a misalignment that will get in the way of me playing my part in this collective, constructive work and the execution of it. Which brings us to 3, improvisation. An exercise like this makes genuine improvisation possible because it doesn't just serve the risk or the issues or the disconnects. It maps the interfaces and the dependencies between people and functions and systems. They're there. They've been talked about. They've been identified. And if you have that shared mental model, it makes pivoting possible when reality diverges. Improvisation in business is not about winging it. I've said often enough on this podcast, heroics, although they might have saved the day and made your money, your business money at times. Heroics is not a sustainable business model. Great improvisation is highly disciplined because you've already talked about some of the alternatives. And so you have maybe not a completely baked, but a reasonably baked plan B and plan C that was at some point talked about in this exercise and has some definition around it. And that is so much quicker to bring to execution than a plan B that wasn't on anybody's radar because they just got presented with a plan A and say, go forth and execute. Yeah. And if the right team was involved in this pre-mortem exercise, they do not need to stop and diagnose if something breaks because they already understand the system well enough to respond. And probably put some monitoring in place to capture the break even before it happens. And what I really like about this, that with the shared map and knowing where the fragilities lie, when stuff does go wrong, you seldom see blame gaming because this is a joint owned plan, right? And people are like, okay, it's not entirely surprised that this is breaking down. We talked about this. This was an inherent risk of the plan. It's not like, oh, I'm caught off guard and now I'm looking for who to assign this to. It's like, yeah, this could happen. So what are we now going to do about it? Also, because there's been trust built up in the exercise, if something goes wrong and somebody whose arena this is, hey, I think we can fix it by just doing a little bit of this or a little bit of that, I see other people accept that very quickly because they're like, hey, I heard them talk about this. I know that they know what they're doing in here. They own this piece. Let's indeed do that. Rather than it really becoming a big group debate again, back to the table. And if you do need to pick up the conversation where you left off because it's a little more complex or really quite different than what you thought, you're building on what was shared and created in that session already. And so you're so much faster again to come up with practical course correction. Because remember, 85% of leaders say that adaptability is critical. But many of us, or only 7% really, feel that we're successfully leading that. And so a pre-mortem can truly close that gap. So, in closing, where do we use this? This is not a decision-making tool. This is also, to me, not something you deploy in day-to-day business. For me, this is a tool, an exercise that you deploy when you have something major or significant going on. So you're going to make a major change. You're kicking off a significant project execution, a big strategy refresh that is going into execution, new investment, new partnership, stuff like that. And you've made the plan and you're kind of at the point where you're ready to start executing it. And before you do this to catch the stuff that you should have known, but maybe wasn't said or wasn't visible because the right faces weren't all in the room together. You can also actually do this when you are in a bit of a pickle and you basically need to make a decision, but you have very little time. Then it becomes a little bit more of a wargaming exercise, but I think the structure can be very helpful in that to kind of say like, well, let's assume we make this, I don't have time to work out 5 alternatives. So let's assume I make this decision. If this is the decision I make, how would we execute that? Does that feel workable? Not enough no's or difficult things around it? Well, let's take this one then, right? It can give you confidence that you've at least fleshed out the major points that could derail or go wrong with the plan. So, in closing, ask yourself, when last something caused a major headache in your business that basically was known by somebody, just not brought to or heard at the right table? We've all have those, right? All the time. Would it have been worse, the 60 minutes with all relevant parties in the room, doing a quick fit for purpose pre-mortem to avoid it? Yes, right? That's what I'm saying. These things pay themselves back, typically before you leave the room. Well, I hope you heard my enthusiasm about this tool. This was it today in the business emergency room. I hope to have you back here in the next episode. Thank you. Bye now. That is your discharge papers from the ER for today. If this episode was useful, please share it, subscribe, and leave a review. It will keep this emergency room open for business and makes a big difference for podcasts like mine. I am Maartje van Krieken, and this show is my own from start to finish. Produced by me, polished by the brilliant team at Hivecast. And remember, this ER is always open. Till next time.